She stood at the fence, tears brimming. "Are you going to laugh at me for being fat too?" she asked. He didn't flinch. "No, ma'am," he said gently. "I think you're beautiful." And everything changed. The first time Thomas McCade saw her, she was standing in the dust beside a dead mule cart, skirts clinging to her legs from heat and panic, hair wind-whipped and face streaked with something that might have been sweat or maybe tears. The trail west from Dry Hollow had a habit of testing folks, breaking them even, but she hadn't broken. Not yet. Just bent under the weight of the world, shoulders drawn forward like someone used to shrinking herself. Her name was Maybelle Crane. She said it soft, eyes down, voice shaking like it might fall apart if she tried too hard to be brave. Thomas, from where he stood on the other side of the broken fence line, didn't speak right away. He took her in with that quiet way of his, the kind that made even the boldest men shift uncomfortably. But there was no judgment in his eyes, just stillness, like the land behind him, wide, worn, and always watching. Maybelle had walked 5 miles after the mule collapsed, pulling a patched wagon behind her with hands rubbed raw and feet that bled in her boots. The boy inside the wagon was her nephew, sick with fever and wrapped in every blanket she could find. His mother, Maybelle's sister, had passed 3 weeks ago in the mining camp, and the man who'd fathered him hadn't claimed the boy then and sure wouldn't now. Maybelle didn't expect help. Not anymore. Every door had shut on her since she'd left the camp. Every glance at her size came with sneers, sideways chuckles, or cruel pity. She didn't know what made her say it. Maybe it was the way the rancher just looked at her, really looked, not past her, not through her, not like she was a burden or a joke. "Are you going to laugh at me for being fat too?" she asked, voice cracking from thirst and shame. Thomas didn't blink. "No, ma'am," he said and stepped forward. "I think you're beautiful." She stared. It didn't register at first. Not after years of insults muttered behind hands and smiles that turned to snickers once her back was turned. The silence stretched between them like a bridge not yet crossed, but Thomas didn't retract the words. He didn't fidget or look away. He just unlatched the gate and walked toward her. "Come on," he said. "We got water, shade, you can rest a while." She hesitated, not because she didn't believe him, but because something about him felt too kind, too steady, like maybe she didn't deserve it. Still she followed. The boy's fever broke that night in the ranch house, thanks to damp cloths and a poultice Thomas remembered his mama using back when he was a boy. Maybelle never left his side. She slept in a chair by the cot, head nodding forward in fits and starts, one hand always resting against the child's back as if willing him to breathe easier. Thomas watched from the doorway. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man of many words, but what he saw there stayed with him. The shape of a woman worn thin by duty and sorrow, clinging to a child that wasn't hers by blood but might as well have been. The next morning, Maybelle stepped out onto the porch. The land spread out before her, dry brush, cattle trails, and the far-off haze of mountains she doubted she'd ever reach. She looked smaller somehow in the light, not in body but in spirit, like she'd peeled off a layer of herself just to keep moving. "I'll be out of your way soon," she said. Thomas was pouring feed for the hens. He didn't look up. "Ain't asked you to go." Maybelle blinked. "You don't even know me." He scooped more grain, then paused. "I know what it looks like when someone's trying too hard not to fall apart." She sat on the step, her dress strained at the seams. Dust clung to the hem. One of her boots had split down the side. "I'm tired," she whispered. "I figured," Thomas said, "but you're still here, that counts for something." Maybelle didn't cry, not then, but something in her chest shifted, cracked just a little. She'd come here hoping for water, shelter, a place to rest before moving on. She hadn't expected kindness. Days passed. The boy Samuel got stronger. He took to Thomas like a duck to water, shadowing him around the ranch with wide eyes and endless questions. Thomas showed him how to hold a hammer, how to check the fence lines. The boy called him Mr. McCade at first, then Sir, and eventually just Thomas, like they'd known each other longer than a week. Maybelle cooked when she could, helped hang laundry, milk the goats, tend the garden. She didn't say much unless spoken to, but she watched everything. Thomas could feel her eyes on him sometimes, when he lifted the feed sacks like they weighed nothing, when he laughed with Samuel, when he sat in silence on the porch with the sunset bleeding red across the land. One night after Samuel had gone to bed, Maybelle found Thomas out by the barn, mending tack by lantern light. "Why are you so kind to us?" she asked, voice barely above a breath. Thomas didn't look up. "Figure someone's got to be." "That's not much of an answer." He chuckled. "It's the only one I got." She stepped closer. Her hands were fidgeting again, the way they always did when she was nervous. "I ain't used to it," she admitted. "People being nice without expecting something." Thomas finally looked at her. "That says more about them than it does about you." She nodded, but didn't speak. A few heartbeats passed in the quiet hum of crickets and wind. "Maybelle," he said after a while, "you and the boy, you ain't in the way, not here." She wanted to believe that. Needed to. But there was a piece of her that had been broken too many times to take those words at face value, so she just said thank you and left it at that. But that night, lying in a borrowed bed with the boy snoring softly beside her, she cried. Not because she was sad, but because for the first time in a long while she didn't feel hated. She didn't feel less. And that scared her more than anything. The next morning, Thomas wasn't in the house or the yard. Maybelle found him at the edge of the property, rifle in hand, staring at tracks in the dirt. He looked up when she approached, his face grim. "Riders pass through," he said, "not from around here." She felt her heart skip. "You think they're coming back?" "Hard to say." Maybelle didn't ask questions. She could see it in his eyes. Whatever peace had settled over the ranch was about to be tested. And deep down, she knew trouble had a way of following the broken, of sniffing out the ones just starting to rebuild. But she wasn't the same woman who'd arrived here, dragging a wagon behind her. And Thomas McCade wasn't the kind of man to run from danger. Not anymore. The day dragged on heavy with silence. Maybelle tried to keep her hands busy, shelling beans, boiling water, tidying the porch, but her eyes kept drifting to the horizon, to the fence line where the prints disappeared into brush. She wasn't a stranger to fear. It had lived inside her for years, curled up like a rattler behind her ribs, but this felt different, not the same fear that came from cruelty or shame. This one was rooted in uncertainty, in the knowledge that something good, something warm and rare, might be stolen before she had a chance to understand it. Thomas didn't speak much that day either. He moved through chores like a man clocking time before the sky split. His dog, an old mutt named Dusty, stayed close to his heel, ears pricked toward every distant sound. Samuel sensed something too. The boy's usual curiosity had quieted. He stuck close to Maybelle, helping where he could, asking questions only when necessary. By sundown, the tracks still hadn't returned. Thomas lit the lanterns early and double-checked the locks on the barn. He brought the horses in, oiled his rifle, and placed a second one by the front door. Maybelle watched all this without asking. She didn't need to. She'd seen men prepare like this before, back in the mining camp when a gambler came up short or when a drunk foreman lost his temper. She knew what readiness looked like, and she saw it now in the way Thomas's jaw tightened when the wind changed. After dinner, Samuel went to sleep without protest. Maybelle sat by the fire, mending one of the boys' shirts. Thomas was across from her, staring into the flames like they held some secret he hadn't yet solved. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer filled with uncertainty. But still, Maybelle felt something rising in her, something she hadn't let speak in years. "You ever lose someone?" she asked softly. Thomas looked up, slow and thoughtful. "Yes." "Family?" He nodded once. "Wife, long time ago." Maybelle folded the shirt neatly across her lap. "Sorry." "Don't be," he said, voice low. "It was a long time ago, but sometimes it still feels like yesterday." She understood that. Grief didn't tell time like clocks did. It circled back when you least expected it, when bread rose too high or a child laughed in just the right tone. She thought of her sister then, the way she used to hum while brushing out her hair, the way she'd held her baby like nothing else in the world mattered. "She was all I had," Maybelle whispered, eyes fixed on the stitched hem in her lap, "and I wasn't enough to keep her safe." Thomas didn't answer with words. He simply leaned forward and placed another log on the fire, the crackle filling the space between their sorrows. Outside, the wind shifted again, colder now, leaner. Maybelle turned her head, listening. "What is it?" Thomas asked, instantly alert. "Don't know, just felt something." He stood, checked the window. Nothing but darkness and the ghost of the moon behind thin clouds. "I'll stay up," he said, "just in case." Maybelle rose too. "I will too." "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I want to." They sat in silence for hours, the fire dimming, the night stretching long and still. At some point Maybelle dozed, her head resting lightly against the back of the chair. Thomas didn't move, just watched the door, the window, the fields beyond. When the knock came, it was soft, careful, too careful. Thomas stood, rifle in hand, before the sound had fully faded. Maybelle's eyes snapped open. He moved to the door and pressed his back against the wall beside it. "Who's there?" His voice was hard now, cold and measured. No answer, then another knock, firmer this time. Thomas cracked the door open, rifle barrel first. 3 men stood outside, dusty coats, one with a scar down his cheek, all of them armed. "We're looking for a woman and a boy," the scarred man said. "Came through this way. Big woman, hard to miss." Maybelle froze, her breath caught in her chest. Thomas didn't flinch. "Ain't seen anyone like that." Scarface narrowed his eyes. "That's so funny, tracks say otherwise." "Tracks lie sometimes." The third man, young, jittery, stepped forward. "Look, we don't want trouble, we just want what's ours." Thomas's eyes didn't move from the leader. "And what's that?" "The boy," Scarface said plainly. "He was stolen." Maybelle stepped forward, her voice shaking but loud. "He wasn't stolen. His mama's dead. She gave him to me." The men shifted. Thomas didn't look at her. "Get back, Maybelle." She ignored him. "I've been raising him since she passed. You never cared about him before." Scarface grinned. "Yeah, but now he's worth something. Widow left a little stake. Land rights, believe it or not, didn't think she had it in her." Thomas's finger twitched near the trigger. "You're not taking him." The air turned still. The younger man's hand hovered near his pistol. The third man looked unsure. Scarface laughed once. "Big words, rancher, but there's 3 of us." Thomas didn't move. "I've buried more than 3. Silence stretched. "Don't be foolish," Scarface said finally. "We'll be back come dawn. You got till then to hand him over." Then they were gone, horses fading into the dark. Thomas closed the door slowly. Maybelle's hands were trembling. She turned to him. "What are we going to do?" He looked at her, calm and steady. "We're going to be ready." That night neither of them slept. They moved like ghosts through the house, boarding windows, checking supplies, counting bullets. Samuel stirred once, asking if everything was all right. Maybelle kissed his forehead and told him to sleep. "It's just a storm coming, sweetheart. We'll ride it out." But her hands didn't stop shaking until near dawn. As the first light broke across the horizon, the knock didn't come. Instead came hooves, 3 riders again, this time slow and deliberate. Thomas stood in the yard, rifle ready. Maybelle watched from the porch. Samuel clutched behind her skirt. Scarface stopped a few feet short, hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Last chance," he called. Thomas didn't answer. Maybelle stepped forward. Her voice cracked, but it rang. "You're not taking him." Scarface laughed. "Big woman with big words, he ain't yours." "He is now," she said, "and I'll die before you take him." That made the man pause. He hadn't expected defiance, not from her. He'd expected tears, pleading, fear. He didn't expect fire. Thomas raised the rifle slowly. "You heard the lady," he said. Scarface's smirk faded. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like eternity. Then the youngest rider turned his horse. "Come on," he muttered. "What?" Scarface barked. "This ain't worth it." Scarface looked between Thomas, Maybelle, and the rifle in his face. Then he spat into the dirt. "Keep the brat, but don't think this is the end." And with that they were gone again. Only this time it felt like for good. Maybelle dropped to the steps, legs buckling. Samuel ran into her arms and she held him tight, her face buried in his hair. Thomas turned to them, rifle still in hand. "You all right?" She looked up, eyes wet but blazing. "I think I am." For the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like a burden or a problem to be fixed. She felt chosen, not just for her strength or her pain, but for her whole self. And as the sun rose behind them, lighting up the land in gold and fire, she realized something else. She wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. The wind had shifted by midday. The scent of dust carried off the hills, brushing the porch railings with the dry breath of something new. Thomas sat on the porch steps sharpening a blade, not because it needed it, but because it gave his hand something to do. Across from him, Maybelle hung sheets on the line, her arms moving steady, sure, the fabric snapping behind her like flags in surrender to the breeze. Samuel was chasing a grasshopper across the yard, his laughter rising, falling like the earth had never held danger just days before. But Thomas couldn't settle, not yet. They hadn't spoken much of what happened, the men, the threat, the way it all could have ended in blood. Maybelle hadn't asked him if she and Samuel could stay, and he hadn't asked her to leave. Some things didn't need saying, but the silence still had weight, not the heavy kind that presses down, but the kind that says something important is coming. She walked over with a pitcher of well water, the sun glowing through her hair, the edge of her smile crooked like she just barely figured out how to do it again. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. Thomas didn't look up from the knife. Men like that, they don't forget when someone says no. "So what do we do?" He wiped the blade clean and finally looked at her. "We make sure they don't want to try again." The words were simple, but something in the way he said them made her heart shift, not with fear, but with a strange, aching gratitude. Later that afternoon, they rode out to the far fence line together, checking posts, looking for anything that needed patching. Maybelle rode one of the older mares, a sweet-tempered gray named Dolly who didn't mind her rider's size or the slower pace. Thomas rode ahead sometimes, but he always doubled back, never straying far. He'd point to a gap in the fence or a pile of scat that meant coyotes had passed, and Maybelle would listen, nod, ask questions when she didn't understand. "You're good at this," he said once, watching her tighten a wire knot with practiced hands. She flushed, "Not really." "You are," he said, voice quiet. "You pay attention, you work steady, you don't complain." "Been around too many who do," she murmured. He smiled then, just a flicker, like it snuck past his ribs before he could stop it. They reached the northern creek by late day. Thomas climbed down and let his horse drink, and Maybelle did the same. The trees here were thicker, the shadows cooler. She sat on a fallen log, watching dragonflies skim the surface of the slow water. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked after a while. Thomas didn't answer right away. He crouched, ran a hand through the water, and watched the ripples fade. "I did once," he said. "After my wife passed, thought there wasn't anything left here for me." "But you stayed." "Didn't know where else to go." She nodded that she understood. They rode back in silence. The land was wide and open, painted in oranges and purples as the sun sank behind the hills. When they reached the homestead, Samuel came running down the path, waving a stick like a sword. "Where'd you go? I thought you weren't coming back." Maybelle scooped him into her arms, laughing for real now. "I told you I would, did I?" "Yeah," he said, then looked at Thomas. "Can I help you fix the gate tomorrow?" Thomas nodded. "You can hand me the nails." They ate dinner by lantern light. Samuel slurped his stew and talked about how he'd named all the chickens. Maybelle listened, eyes soft, occasionally brushing her hand against the back of the boy's head without thinking. Thomas didn't say much, but he watched them, and something in his chest stirred. A warmth, a longing. That night, as Maybelle washed dishes and Thomas dried, she glanced at him and asked the question that had been clawing at her all week. "Do you mean it?" He looked at her. "Mean what?" "What you said, that first day, when I asked if you were going to laugh at me." He didn't flinch. "Yes, I meant it." She stared into the soapy water. Most men don't say things like that unless they're trying to be cruel or make a joke of you later. Thomas leaned back against the counter. "You think I'm that kind of man?" She shook her head quickly. "No, that's the problem." He set the towel down. "Why is that a problem?" "Because I don't know what to do with kindness. I don't know what to do with someone seeing me and not pitying me, or mocking me, or expecting me to earn it." Thomas stepped closer, just enough that she could feel the space between them tighten. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "You just accept it, same way you'd accept rain after a long drought." She blinked fast, trying to push the sting away, but tears came anyway. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered. "You're not." "I'm not pretty, I know that, I'm too." He shook his head. "Don't do that, don't tear yourself down before anyone else gets the chance. You're strong, you're kind, you're real. That's worth more than you think." Maybelle turned her face away, trying to hide the tears, but Thomas saw, and he didn't look away. "You don't have to believe it all at once," he said, "but you'll believe it eventually. I'll make sure of it." She didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. That night she lay in bed with Samuel curled beside her, his small hand tangled in the hem of her nightdress. The room was quiet, the only sound the low hum of wind through the shutters. She stared at the ceiling, heart racing, mind whirling. She was falling for him, not in the childish way she used to fall for smiles and smooth talk. This was deeper, slower, built not on flattery but on safety, on honesty, on presence. And that terrified her. The next morning came with a letter. A rider brought it just after breakfast. Dusty from the trail, he tipped his hat and handed it over without much ceremony. "From Jasper Ridge, lawyer's office." Maybelle took it with trembling hands. She hadn't heard that name in years. She opened it slowly, scanning the lines. Her breath caught. It was about Samuel. Apparently, her sister's late husband had filed papers claiming the child had no known living relatives aside from himself, despite having abandoned the boy. The estate, small but real, was being contested. If Maybelle didn't appear in person within a week, custody would be transferred, permanently. Her knees buckled. She sank into the chair on the porch, the paper fluttering in her hands like a leaf caught in wind. Thomas read it over her shoulder. "You can't let them take him." "I don't have money for a lawyer," she said. "I barely have a change of clothes." He crouched beside her. "You've got more than that." She looked at him, eyes wide. "What do you mean?" "I'll take you to Jasper Ridge." He nodded. "We'll leave at first light." She started to argue, but the words never came, just a tear, then a second, and Thomas reached for her hand. "We'll fight for him, together." She nodded, because there was no other choice. Samuel was hers, heart and soul. She wasn't going to let the world take him too. The next day they loaded supplies, saddled horses, gave Samuel the choice, stay with a friend of Thomas's nearby or come along. "I'm not leaving you," the boy said, voice fierce. So they rode. The sun beat down hot and merciless. The trail to Jasper Ridge was long and rough. Bandits roamed the middle hills. Storms brewed near the canyon pass. But none of it mattered, because now Maybelle had something worth protecting, and someone willing to ride beside her into whatever came next. The trail to Jasper Ridge was rough, more rock than road, winding through parched brushland and the skeletons of long-dead trees. Clouds boiled low on the horizon, heavy with promise, but the sun still pressed down hard, drawing sweat from every seam. Maybelle rode with her shoulders stiff, her skirts damp and clinging, her eyes locked forward with a focus Thomas hadn't seen before. Not even when she first arrived at his gate, half-starved and half-shattered. This was different, fiercer. Samuel sat in front of her on the saddle, wrapped in a spare wool cloak despite the heat. The boy had gone quiet, not the quiet of sulking or sleep, but the quiet that came when a child understood the weight of things too big for him. His small fingers gripped the saddle horn, knuckles white, though he never once complained. They camped that first night in a dip between hills, where the wind was less cruel and the brush offered some cover. Thomas built a small fire, more for warmth and morale than anything else. He kept the flames low, shielding the flicker with stacked stones. Bandits weren't a guarantee on these trails, but they were a risk he wouldn't ignore. Maybelle didn't ask him if they'd be safe. She just helped roll out blankets, portioned the salted meat and dry biscuits, and fed Samuel bit by bit until he yawned and curled up against her hip, fast asleep beneath her arm. Thomas sat across from her, his rifle across his knees, one boot tapping a rhythm into the dust. "You don't talk much," she said softly. He raised an eyebrow. "Never did. But you see everything." "I try." She looked down at the fire, the shadows dancing against her face. "I used to think being quiet made a man dangerous." He smirked. "Sometimes it does. But with you, it's like your quiet's not hiding anything. It just is." He nodded once like that made sense. Most folks talk too much, say things they don't mean just to fill the air. "And you?" "I wait till I mean it." She let that settle between them. She thought of all the words she'd heard in her life, all the laughter, the insults, the hollow compliments wrapped in pity. None of it had meant anything. But when Thomas had called her beautiful, it had stuck, not because it was flowery or poetic, but because he said it plain, like it wasn't up for debate. "You scared?" he asked after a while. "Yes," she said. "You?" "A little." She smiled faintly. "Good, then we're even." Sleep didn't come easy that night. Thomas kept watch, switching shifts with Maybelle even though she insisted he take more rest. When she sat by the fire, eyes scanning the darkness, she realized she didn't feel afraid of the dark itself anymore. Just of losing the boy, of losing this place they'd made between the silence and the shared burdens. Morning came with a pink horizon and a howl on the wind. Not wolves, not coyotes. A sound too human for comfort, far off but unmistakable. They rode harder after that. Thomas kept a hand near his revolver. Maybelle gripped the reins tight, her thighs aching from the saddle, but she didn't complain once. Samuel clung to her waist, the movement of the horse lulling him into long, blinking silences. By noon, they reached the edge of the dry canyon, nothing but red rock and winding gullies. The only way across was the bridge, old, half-rotten, and barely wide enough for a horse to walk straight. Thomas dismounted and led his horse across first, testing each step with the patience of a man who knew wood could lie. It held, barely. Maybelle went next. The bridge groaned under their weight, boards cracked, rope hissed. She held her breath. Samuel clutched her tight, and when they made it across, she could have collapsed from relief. They were halfway to Jasper Ridge when the dust cloud rose behind them. 3 riders. Vast. Thomas didn't hesitate. He turned his horse hard and pulled Maybelle's reins. "Off the trail," he said. "Now." They veered down a shallow ravine, ducking behind sandstone boulders and dry scrub. The horses breathed hard, flecked with foam. Samuel looked up at her, confused. "Is it them?" I don't know, she whispered, but we're not waiting to find out. Thomas crouched beside a boulder, peering through the gap with narrowed eyes. The riders passed the trail overhead, not slowing, not looking down. He exhaled. They didn't see us. Maybelle sat back against the rock, heart thudding so loud she thought Samuel could hear it. She pulled him close, kissed the top of his head, and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared in years. Please, Lord, just let us make it. They rode again at dusk, avoiding the open trails now, cutting through arroyos and deer paths, trusting Thomas's instincts. By the time the lights of Jasper Ridge twinkled on the horizon, Maybelle's body ached like she'd been pulled through fire. But she didn't complain. Couldn't. Not when the courthouse waited. Not when Samuel's future hung on what she could prove. They reached the edge of town under cover of darkness. Thomas tied the horses behind the churchyard and led them through the back alleys, past the general store and the saloon where laughter poured like whiskey through the open doors. Maybelle kept her head down, one hand on Samuel's shoulder. She could feel eyes already, men lingering near barrels, women watching from windows. Fat woman. Big girl. That's what they'd whisper. That's what they'd always whispered. But she didn't break stride. The lawyer's office was a cramped, second-floor room above a cobbler's shop. The man who answered the door was in his 50s, with a crooked nose and eyes that moved like he was always calculating something. "You're Maybelle Crane?" he asked, peering over spectacles. "Yes." "Name S. Wendell Price. I'm the one handling the petition. You're a day early." "We couldn't afford to be late." He nodded. "Come in." The office smelled like old paper and pipe smoke. Samuel sat in the corner, clutching his canteen, while Thomas leaned near the window, eyes scanning the street below. Wendell flipped through a folder, muttering under his breath. "Says here your sister left the boy to you." "She told me herself," Maybelle said. "Everyone in the camp knew she was dying." "Any signed document?" "No," she admitted. "She couldn't write, but folks saw. They knew she wanted him with me." Wendell made a face. "The father's lawyer is pushing hard, claiming neglect, claiming you're unfit." Maybelle stiffened. "Unfit? He'll bring up your size, your lack of money, no fixed home." Thomas stepped forward then. "She's more fit than most mothers I've seen. Raised that boy without a cent or complaint. He's alive because of her." Wendell sighed. "Look, I'm not here to decide. I just argue what I can. The judge hears the case tomorrow morning. Be ready." They took lodging in a small room behind the church, a place the pastor let them sleep for free after hearing part of their story. Maybelle didn't rest. She paced, rehearsed what she'd say, what she wouldn't, how she'd hold herself, how she'd keep from breaking. Thomas sat on the cot, watching her like he wanted to take the weight off her back and carry it himself. "You'll do fine," he said. "You don't know that." "I know you." She looked at him then, eyes raw. "If they take him, I don't know who I'll be." He stood, crossed the room in 2 steps, and gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. "They won't." "But if they do?" "They won't," he said again, firmer. Her breath hitched, and then she did something she hadn't planned, hadn't dared. She leaned forward and kissed him. Not out of longing, but out of gratitude, out of desperation, out of something bigger than both. He didn't pull away. When morning came, she walked into the courthouse with Samuel's hand in hers, Thomas at her back, and her chin held high. Whatever happened next, she would not go down begging. Not this time. Not ever again. The courthouse was a square, sun-faded building squatting near the center of Jasper Ridge like it had grown up out of the dirt itself. Its stone steps were worn smooth from years of boots and storms and verdicts, some fair, some not. Maybelle stood at the bottom, staring up at those doors like they were the gates of something sacred and cruel all at once. Her dress was the cleanest she owned, patched at the seams, ironed with careful hands the night before. Her hair was braided tight, the way her sister used to wear it. Samuel stood beside her in a borrowed shirt, his shoes freshly polished by Thomas before dawn. Thomas hadn't said much that morning. He'd saddled the horses, brewed bitter coffee, and watched the street from behind the churchyard fence. But when it came time to leave, he didn't hesitate. He walked with them up the courthouse steps, one hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, steady and sure as an anchor. Inside, the courtroom was small, the benches smooth from decades of shifting weight and whispered prayers. The judge was already seated, a wiry man with a long mustache and eyes that missed nothing. Wendell Price sat at one table, fanning himself with a folded paper. Across from him, dressed in a suit too fine for a place like this, was the lawyer for the father. And seated behind him, arms crossed, jaw tight, boots polished to a smug shine, was Harvey DeWitt, Samuel's father. Maybelle had only seen him once before, from across a campfire. He hadn't held the baby, hadn't said a word when her sister coughed blood into her handkerchief. He'd simply turned and walked away before the sun came up. Now he looked at her like she was the problem. "All rise," the bailiff called. The judge cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and peered down at the papers in front of him. "We're here today to determine legal guardianship of the minor, Samuel Crane, in the absence of his deceased mother, Elsie Crane. Present are Maybelle Crane, sister of the deceased and petitioner, and Mr. Harvey DeWitt, biological father." The judge's voice was calm, but Maybelle felt the heat rise to her face. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Wendell stood. "Your Honor, Ms. Crane has cared for Samuel since his mother passed 3 weeks ago. She was appointed in practice, if not in writing. She has fed him, clothed him, and made every attempt to secure a stable life for the child." DeWitt's lawyer rose. "Objection, Your Honor, that's opinion, not fact. There's no documentation proving this woman is fit to parent, no income, no property, no husband, and forgive me, but her appearance alone." The judge cut him off with a hard glare. "Counselor, sit down." The lawyer huffed but obeyed. The judge turned to Maybelle. "Ms. Crane, do you wish to speak for yourself?" She stood slowly. Her legs trembled, but her voice didn't. "I do." "Go on." She glanced at Samuel, who gave her the faintest nod, his little face pale but brave. "I know I don't look like what some folks call a mother," she began, voice even. "I'm not rich. I'm not married. I wasn't born with soft hands or an easy life. But I've raised this boy since the day his mama closed her eyes for the last time. I fed him when I couldn't eat myself. I walked 10 miles just to find someone who'd help me lower her body into the ground." She paused. The courtroom was silent. "I never asked for praise. I never thought I'd have to stand in front of strangers and prove I loved a child. But I do, with everything I have. And I won't stand by while someone who never lifted a finger to help tries to take him now just because the law says he can." The judge studied her for a long time, then he nodded. "Mr. DeWitt," he said, "do you wish to speak?" Harvey DeWitt stood. His voice was flat, cold. "I have a right to my son. I didn't know about the land, that's true, but now I do, and I aim to raise him proper." Thomas shifted behind her. Maybelle felt the heat of his anger like coals at her back, but he stayed silent. "Do you have a home, Mr. DeWitt?" the judge asked. "Working on it." "A job?" "Got prospects?" "And what changed, if I may ask, between the day of your son's birth and today?" Harvey hesitated. Man can change his mind. The judge didn't reply. He scribbled something in his ledger, then leaned back. "This court needs a moment to deliberate." Everyone stood as the judge disappeared into his chambers. Maybelle sat slowly, the strength draining from her all at once. Samuel climbed into her lap, and she held him tight, her chin resting against the crown of his head. Thomas crouched beside them. "You did good." "It's not enough," she whispered. "I can feel it. He's got money, he's got the name, they'll give him everything." Thomas looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes, but it wasn't fear for himself. It was for her. The door opened again, and the judge re-entered. "All rise." Everyone stood. The judge cleared his throat. "This is not an easy matter. The law favors bloodlines, but this court also considers the welfare of the child to be paramount." Maybelle's heart thundered in her ears. "After reviewing testimony, I find that Mr. DeWitt has not shown consistent interest in the child's well-being until the matter of inheritance became known. However, the law also requires some form of stability for guardianship to be granted outside parental lines." She closed her eyes. "Therefore, I am granting temporary guardianship to Ms. Crane for a period of 6 months, during which time she must establish permanent residence and means of income. After that period, a final ruling will be made." Her knees nearly gave out. She clutched Samuel tighter. 6 months, not forever, but not lost either. Harvey DeWitt's face darkened. "This ain't over," he muttered. Thomas stepped between him and Maybelle. "No, it ain't, and if you come near them again, you won't walk away with words." The lawyer tugged Harvey's arm. "Let's go." They left. Outside, the sky broke open and it began to rain, not heavy, not loud, but soft, gentle, like the earth had finally exhaled. Maybelle stood under the eaves of the courthouse, watching the drops gather on the railing. Samuel leaned against her side, and Thomas stood close, his hand resting on her back. "You did it," he said. She shook her head. "We did." They spent that night in a cabin just outside town, a gift from the pastor. Thomas built a fire. Maybelle cooked eggs and cornmeal in an old skillet. Samuel slept early, wrapped in quilts and dreams. Later, Thomas poured her coffee and they sat together near the fire. She looked at him and felt the tears come again, slow, grateful, fierce. "I didn't know men like you existed," she said. He looked into her eyes. "I didn't think women like you did." She laughed through her tears. "What kind is that?" "The kind that fights with her whole soul." She reached for his hand. "I don't know what's going to happen in 6 months." "Neither do I," he said, "but I know you won't be alone." The fire crackled. The rain tapped the roof. And for the first time in her life, Maybelle didn't feel like she had to apologize for taking up space. She just was. And she was loved. The land between Jasper Ridge and the ranch was washed fresh by rain. Where dust had once choked the trail, now mud clung to their boots, and the grass shimmered with a rare green. The sun broke through clouds with a gentleness not often found in that country, casting everything in a soft gold as if heaven had passed a hand across the world and decided, for just a moment, to let it rest. Maybelle sat tall in the saddle, Samuel pressed close in front of her, his head tucked beneath her chin. She was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was something more like reverence, like she was afraid if she spoke too loud the peace might scatter. Thomas rode just ahead, his silhouette framed by the rising light. He hadn't said much since the courthouse. He didn't need to. The ride home wasn't fast, wasn't slow. It was deliberate, steady. They didn't stop to look back. What waited behind them wasn't worth remembering. It was the ranch that mattered now. They crested the final ridge just before noon, and the sight of the homestead below, its crooked fence, the tilting barn, the cabin still bearing storm patches, made Maybelle's throat tighten. "Is this home now?" Samuel asked, voice small. She looked down at him, smiled faintly, and nodded. "Yes, baby, this is home." They dismounted slowly. Maybelle stretched, her body aching from days in the saddle, but her legs felt stronger now. The weakness was leaving her, not just in muscle, but in spirit. Thomas led the horses to the trough and began unbuckling saddles. Maybelle carried Samuel inside, his arms wrapped tight around her neck. He was asleep before she laid him on the cot. The quilt Thomas had given them their first night still smelled like smoke and pine. She brushed a curl from the boy's forehead and lingered, just watching him breathe. She found Thomas outside, chopping wood. "You never stop working, do you?" she asked, arms crossed lightly. He paused, wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. "I don't sleep well when I'm idle. I think I'm the opposite." He gave a soft chuckle. "That's why we balance each other." She stepped closer, the sunlight catching her face. "We do, don't we?" His eyes met hers. He didn't speak, but something passed between them again, something quiet and deep. A recognition, a kind of knowing that didn't need words. Later that week, she began taking charge of the garden. The rains had softened the earth, and she knelt in the rows, pressing seeds into damp soil with practiced hands. Samuel helped, digging shallow trenches and asking questions about what would grow and when. "Corn takes patience," she told him, "but it's worth it." "Like you and Thomas?" he asked, tilting his head. She laughed. "Maybe so." Inside, she began sewing again. Old curtains were cut into pillowcases, torn shirts patched and hemmed. She took stock of what they had and made plans for what they didn't. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building. Thomas noticed. He came in one evening to find the table cleared, the floor swept, the stew bubbling over a fire that smelled of bay leaf and something sweet. Maybelle stood in the doorway, apron streaked with flour, hair tucked up in a scarf. "Smells like someone's trying to impress me," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "If you think this is for you, you're twice the fool." He laughed, a real one this time, a low, warm thing that filled the room. He pulled out a chair and sat, watching her move with ease between tasks. "You ever think about staying?" he asked, just loud enough for her to hear. She stopped, turned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, permanently, this place, with me, with the boy." She hesitated, not because she didn't want it, but because the want was too much. "I don't know if I'd make a good wife," she said finally. "I didn't ask for a good wife," he said. "I asked if you'd stay." She set down the spoon and crossed the room. "Do you mean it?" He rose, towering over her, every word. And then, slowly, like the tide easing against the shore, he reached out and brushed her cheek with the back of his hand. "I've been alone a long time, Maybelle, not just in this house, but in my soul." She took his hand, held it against her cheek. "So have I." They didn't kiss, not then, it wasn't time, but the moment settled between them like a seed planted in the dark, something waiting to bloom. A week passed, then two. Maybelle began taking trips into town alone. She sold patchwork quilts and jars of preserves. Folks still stared, still whispered, but she didn't shrink. She met their eyes, her back straight, her chin high. When one man muttered something crude behind her back, she turned and looked him dead in the face. "You've got something to say it louder, or keep walking." He said nothing. And she smiled. One afternoon, while walking back from the well, she heard Thomas calling her name. Not loud, not panicked, but urgent. She dropped the bucket and ran. He was in the barn, kneeling beside a calf tangled in barbed wire. Blood streaked its flank. Thomas's hands were red, the wire cutters beside him. She panicked, he said, ran through the fence. Without hesitation, Maybelle dropped beside him, holding the calf's head in her lap, whispering soft nonsense until it stilled. Thomas worked quickly, hands sure, breath steady. When the wire came free, he pressed a cloth to the wound, and Maybelle wrapped her arms around the shivering animal like it was her own child. They worked until the calf could stand. When it stumbled into the straw, Thomas sat back and looked at her. "You didn't flinch." "I've seen worse," she said, wiping her hands. "But you didn't look away." "I don't anymore." He nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting. "That's what I love about you." The words dropped like a stone in a still pond. He didn't take them back, didn't soften them, just said them plain the way he always did. She froze, heart pounding. "What?" "I said I love you." Tears welled unbidden. You don't have to say that. I know. She stepped toward him, but you mean it. Every word. She looked at him, really looked. The man who'd opened his door to her without question, who'd fought for her without hesitation, who'd seen her every inch, every flaw, and never once turned away. I love you too, she whispered. And this time they kissed. It wasn't fire or thunder. It was something quieter, truer, like roots growing deep in soil, like the first drop of rain after a long drought. Later that night, Samuel climbed into her lap as she sat by the fire. Are we staying forever now? He asked sleepily. She kissed the top of his head, forever and a day. But nothing good lasts without challenge. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Sealed in red wax, official. Maybelle opened it with trembling fingers. Harvey DeWitt had filed an appeal. He was coming back. And this time, he had proof she wasn't suitable for full custody. Thomas read the letter, jaw tightening. Let him come, he said. We're ready now. But Maybelle wasn't so sure. Because some fights couldn't be won with words. And the past had a way of dragging itself through the door, whether you invited it or not. The letter sat on the table like a coiled snake, unopened but no longer sleeping. Even after Thomas read it aloud, every line dipped in that legal syrup meant to sound polite while tearing through bone. It still pulsed with menace. Maybelle stood across the room, her hands in fists at her sides, her breath short, uneven. Appeal granted. Hearing set. Guardian must appear or forfeit custody. There were no other details, no signatures, no faces, no promises. Just the cold, sharp edge of threat veiled in the robes of process. Thomas watched her closely, but he didn't approach. He knew better than to rush her grief or her rage. It was a storm she had to stand in for a moment, barefaced. When she did look up, her eyes were dry but burning. Why? She asked. He didn't answer right away, because they both knew the answer. Because Harvey DeWitt didn't care about Samuel. He cared about control, about appearance, about beating the system that dared choose someone like Maybelle over him. I thought we bought peace, she said bitterly. I thought 6 months would give us space to breathe. You did everything right, Thomas said, and it still wasn't enough. That doesn't mean you stop. She walked to the window, arms wrapped around herself. Outside, the chickens clucked aimlessly. The wind tugged the line of laundry like fingers prying at seams. It all looked the same, but everything had changed. Again. I'm so tired, Thomas. I know. No, I mean tired in my bones. Tired of begging life to leave me one good thing. He crossed to her then, rested his hand on her back. You don't have to beg, you fight. She looked up at him, tears now threatening. I don't want to raise him in a courtroom. You won't. Then how do we stop this? Thomas hesitated, then reached into the cabinet and pulled out a tin box. It was old, the edges dented, the lid rusted at the corners. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside were papers, yellowed deeds, letters, receipts. What's all this? She asked. My father's land claim, the original one. He pulled one page from the stack and smoothed it flat. This ranch, it's more than just soil. It borders the river bend Harvey's after. He wants access, not to the boy, not to you, to the water. Maybelle stared at the map. So it's leverage. Thomas nodded. If I sign over the access, he backs off. No, she said immediately. You can't. That land is yours. And Samuel's yours, he replied calmly. She looked at him, unsure if she was more astonished or angry. You'd give up part of your land for me. I'd give up the whole ranch to keep you two here. She shook her head, her voice rising. You don't understand. I don't want you to sacrifice for me. I want this to be ours, built, not bartered. Thomas placed his hands on her shoulders, firm. Then we fight it your way. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Maybelle wrote letters to the judge, to former neighbors in the camp, to anyone who might offer testimony on her behalf. Thomas helped gather character statements. Samuel drew pictures for the judge, unprompted. Crayon drawings of the ranch, of Maybelle reading to him, of Thomas showing him how to plant corn. The town preacher wrote a letter of his own. So did the school teacher, the woman who sold Maybelle thread at the general store, and even old Mr. Wiggins, the cantankerous rancher 2 ridges over who hadn't spoken to Thomas in 5 years. "Woman's the real thing," Wiggins scrawled in a shaky hand. "That boy's lucky, so's the rancher." Maybelle read it and wept. Still, the date loomed. The hearing was set for the end of the month, and word spread fast, as it always did. By the time they rode back into Jasper Ridge, Maybelle could feel the eyes on her before she even crossed the saloon's shadow. But she didn't flinch. They lodged again at the church house. Samuel slept with his arms wrapped tight around his pillow, and Maybelle sat on the porch with a candle in her lap, watching moths spiral and burn. Thomas joined her quietly. He held out a bundle wrapped in cloth. "What's this?" "Something my mother gave me, when I told her I loved a woman who didn't fit what the world expected." Maybelle unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small silver cross strung on a leather cord, simple, worn, and beautiful. "She told me love isn't about what fits," Thomas said. "It's about what holds." Maybelle closed her fingers around the charm. "I don't know if I can win tomorrow." "You already did." She looked at him, heart aching. "What if they take him anyway?" "Then we get him back, one way or another." The hearing wasn't in a courtroom this time. It was in a side chamber, just a judge, 2 lawyers, Maybelle, and Harvey DeWitt seated with his collar too stiff and his smirk too sharp. The judge was different now, a woman stern and sharp-eyed. Maybelle stood and read her statement aloud. She spoke of nights walking the trail alone, of sewing Samuel's first shirt from scraps, of learning to read with him, of building a life from splinters and prayer. She didn't cry, but her voice cracked. Once, just once, when she said, "He calls me Mama now, and I call him mine." The judge listened in silence. Then it was Harvey's turn. His lawyer launched into claims: unstable living, history of poverty, social stigma. He cited Maybelle's size as a health concern, hinted that the boy's future would be jeopardized by remaining with her, that she wasn't married, that she couldn't provide. Then Harvey stood, turned to face the judge. "I've had time to think," he said, "and I believe my son deserves more." Maybelle felt her stomach turn. "But," he continued, voice carefully rehearsed, "if the court deems it better, I won't contest custody, provided I'm allowed visitation and the claim to the river tract is honored." Thomas sat up straighter. It was blackmail, veiled as compromise. The judge looked at Maybelle. "Do you agree to these terms?" "No," Maybelle said at once. Harvey's lawyer sputtered. "She's rejecting the offer." "I am," Maybelle said, her voice low, "because I won't let my son be used as a bargaining chip, not by him, not by anyone." The judge paused, then nodded once. "Noted." 2 hours later, they were told to return in the morning for the verdict. That night Maybelle walked the edge of the churchyard barefoot, the cross from Thomas around her neck. She prayed, not for victory, but for peace, for strength, for the wisdom to endure if the answer came back wrong. Thomas found her as the sky turned pink. He didn't speak, just stood beside her, watching dawn rise over the chapel spire. When they returned to the hearing room, the judge was already seated. Everyone stood. She read from a single page. "This court finds that Maybelle Crane has demonstrated clear, continued, and selfless care for the child in question. She has provided food, shelter, education, and emotional stability in the face of immense difficulty. Mr. DeWitt has shown interest primarily in matters of inheritance and leverage." She looked up. "Full custody is granted to Maybelle Crane, Effective immediately. No visitation rights required. The room stilled. Harvey stood, face red. This is a mistake. Thomas rose. No, it's justice. Harvey stepped forward, but the bailiff blocked him. Time to go. And just like that, he was gone. Outside, Maybelle sat on the courthouse steps, Samuel curled in her lap. She held him tight, the sun warm on her shoulders. Thomas sat beside her. Now what? She asked. He reached over, took her hand. Now we go home. They returned to the ranch at dusk, the trail familiar now, each turn in the road, each bent fence post, each creek crossing like a note in a song they'd come to know by heart. The sun dropped behind the hills in ribbons of fire and gold, and Maybelle watched it with eyes that didn't just see the beauty, they felt it. Deep. As if every mile traveled, every tear shed, every courtroom breath held had carved out a place inside her that could finally hold peace. Samuel rode beside her on Dolly now. He was too big to be tucked in front anymore, too proud. He gripped the reins with both hands and kept stealing glances at her, like he couldn't quite believe they were going back whole. Thomas rode behind them, quiet as ever, his eyes scanning the tree line even though the threat was gone. That's just how he was, still, careful, strong. The kind of man who stood like a wall when everything else crumbled. Maybelle didn't speak for most of the ride, and neither did the men. Some things didn't need narrating. You didn't explain a sunrise. You didn't talk through a prayer answered. You just lived it. When the cabin came into view, Maybelle felt her chest tighten. The roof still bore the patch Thomas had made in the spring rains. The porch was still uneven. The garden fence still leaned toward the barn like it was tired from holding up so long. But it was theirs. Not just a place to sleep, not a stopping point, but a home carved out of trial and made whole through choice. Samuel slid off the saddle and ran ahead, whooping, arms wide. He disappeared behind the cabin and came back with Dusty on his heels, the old dog barking once, happy and stiff. Thomas dismounted and led the horses to the trough. Maybelle lingered in the yard, her hand resting on the saddle horn, her eyes scanning the horizon like it might call her back to the fight. But there was no echo, no threat, just the wind through the grass and the smell of pine. Later, after the bags were unpacked and the fire built, she stood at the window while the stew simmered, watching the hills darken and the first stars appear. Thomas approached, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one and leaned against the frame beside her. "You sure you want this?" he asked, not with doubt but care. Maybelle didn't answer right away. She sipped the coffee, hot and bitter. Then she turned to him. "I never thought I'd be wanted," she said. "Not like this, not fully." He looked at her. "You were always worthy. Even when I was ashamed. Especially then." She smiled, slow and aching. "Then yes, I want this, I want you." He set his mug down. "Then we make it real." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean tomorrow after chores, you and me and the preacher." Maybelle's mouth parted in shock. "Thomas." He held up a hand. "No big speeches, just a vow, just a beginning." She laughed, a real laugh, loud and full. "You proposing while I'm in this old apron?" "I'm proposing because I've waited long enough." She wiped a tear with her knuckle. "Yes, then yes." The next morning, they married under the oak tree near the back pasture. The preacher from Jasper Ridge rode out at dawn, dusty and smiling. Samuel wore a clean shirt, too big in the shoulders, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself. Together. And when folks in town tried to whisper about her size or her past or her name, they found no echo, because the woman they gossiped about had become something untouchable, not because she was rich, not because she was loud, but because she was rooted. Because Thomas McCade never wavered at her side. Because Samuel ran to her arms after school every day like it was the only place on earth he felt safe. Because the land had bent to her hands and bloomed. Years later, when folks told stories about the ranch north of Jasper Ridge, They didn't talk about its yield, or its water, or its acreage. They talked about the woman who changed it. The woman who arrived with nothing but a sick boy and a spine made of iron. The woman who loved a quiet rancher and made him whole again. The woman who never apologized for her shape or her story. The woman who was laughed at once, but never again. Because in the end, love didn't ask for apologies. It just asked for truth. And Maybelle Crane had never been more herself.